It's the supplement that was published on Sunday, the 18th of August. And this week I called it Hardship. So, as you know, I like to start with a quote. And this week's was: hardships often prepare people, ordinary people, for an extraordinary destiny. And that was from C.S. Lewis, the author. So before I get cracking, I just want to tell you about the Property Business Workshop that we're running on Tuesday, the 1st of October. This time round, we're covering exits. We run 4 of these workshops a year, and this is the 4th one for 2024. And there are 2 main points in this workshop. Firstly, it's about planning your own exit, which is something often people don't do very well, usually because they put it off again and again and again. But also, it's maybe more importantly, helping to understand other people's exits and their exit plans or lack of them. And that will help you if you're looking to buy a portfolio or a business or anything like that from a vendor. If you can help the vendor get what they want, what they need, and what they deserve when they're exiting, then you can work towards true win-win situations. And as always, it will be an action-packed, content-filled day, which hopefully will stand alone in helping to advance your understanding as a property business owner. There are still super early bird tickets available. There's only a little bit over a week left on the super early bird pricing, so do hurry up and get those bought now. They're on bit.ly/PBWFOUR. So, thanks for listening to that. Welcome to the supplement. It was that really typical 2nd/3rd week of a month that we get sometimes, where so much important macro data slides in, comes in together, and it almost generates too much for one supplement. But as usual, I've tried to condense it as much as possible and just pull the important parts out that I'm going to talk about. So, the quote and the headline for this week, talking about the hardship, is really referring to the last fortnight of speculation over hardship tests and their introduction into the UK private rental sector market. I want to be a bit broader than that, though, and talk about the mistakes in rhetoric that I see some of the government ministers currently making, in the vain hope that this gets a bit of a wider reach than usual and is put in front of sensible and pragmatic MPs who want to take the housing sector forward without ideology dominating their decision making. We can always hope, right? We've all got to have goals and targets. But of course, I'm going to get straight on with the real-time market analysis first of all, because this one's going to get really chunky if I don't plough through it. So first of all, props to Chris Watkin, as always, who delivers these week in, week out. Listings have continued their tear upwards for the year, still well above historical averages, plenty of willing sellers. Net sales are really moving forward, and it's relatively easy to see compared to 2023, because it was a universally better environment for buying in Q1 23, because bond yields actually came right back down to below 3% at one point in early 2023 after Rishi had taken over from Liz Truss and was still nearing some kind of honeymoon period, or at least people were grateful that he wasn't Liz Truss and Jeremy Hunt wasn't Kwasi Kwarteng. But it was definitely a worse buying environment in Q2 2023 as yields absolutely soared again to hit nearly 5%, which put mortgage costs right up. There was also a lot of uncertainty around the direction of house prices, if you remember, and although I constantly give the forecasters a tough time for getting these things completely wrong, one thing they did get wrong in 2023 is that the market would move downward in pricing. It didn't move downward anywhere near as much as any of them suggested that it would, but it did ultimately go downwards in pricing. So that uncertainty about the direction of house prices, I think at the moment, in my opinion, largely speaking, seems to be over. It's over as far as the RICS surveyors house price balance and the monthly reporting goes. It's over even as far as some of the more bearish commentators go. They have switched forecasts to upwards, up and up again over the next 5 years. So invoke Yaz and the plastic population one more time. The only way is up from here for UK house prices, folks, for the moment anyway. So this week compared to the same in 2023 had nearly 24% more net sales. Year to date, that number is 11.6%, which would see us on course for more than 1.1 million transactions, and a year that would go down in the history books as one of reasonable health for the property market. I'm sticking to my 5% prediction for capital growth for 2024. I noticed the other day the ONS had lowered their final result for 2023 to minus 2.8%, which nearly hit my forecast range that year of minus 3 to minus 5. Initially, the print was minus 2.2 when I first looked at it, so that might put the annual growth back to 6%, maybe more for 2024, because we started at a 0.6% lower base. But let's see. I'm quite happy to be wrong on the downside, of course. So next, I think there's a pretty surprising figure. In July 2024, 52.5% of homes that left the books of the UK estate agents exchanged contracts. The remaining 47.5% were withdrawn from the market unsold. That looks and feels very wrong to me. Are there really that many tyre kickers from the vendor perspective out there? And of course it could be including things like changing agents and things like that, but it could be just there's too many listings and they're backed up from those who did not want to list in the colder market of late 2022 and most of 2023, if not all of it. Fall throughs also crept back up to 26.6%. It's ahead of that long-term average of 24.2, but there has been this trend upwards over recent weeks, and you are led to speculate what's behind that, really. Maybe as the market starts to openly heat up and more positive headlines start to appear, I think it's going to come back downwards again. Listing prices look really realistic at the moment. The difference between this week's listing prices and those marked sold subject to contract was 13.2%. Now, the long-term average for that number is between 16 and 17. So stock replacement for what is sold is not coming on at a far higher price than has been the case in recent times. So a realistically priced market, generally speaking, at the moment. And it's taking 6 days less to exchange a property than it was 12 months ago. But pipelines are 25+% larger than pre-pandemic years, as the time taken to get to completion is still too slow. Okay, mini rant over there. Now, the macro, it's absolute meatiest this week. We've got employment, unemployment, the labour market, we've got inflation, we've got growth. In fact, I'll have to hold off commentary around retail sales until next week because I can't bump Gilt Watch and the swap market summary that I have in every week. So this was the week that spurred headlines such as UK economy data evidences best performance in G7 and similar, although it's only very close to the US. Of course, the US has had that recent recession wobble that I talked about last week. So hopefully perhaps we're still outperforming the US market, but we'll see. They do tend to put in far better growth figures than the UK as a rule. So firstly, the labour market report, which was a big surprise really, because consensus suggested unemployment would tick up further. I've been suggesting for the last 2 months or so that it probably wouldn't, and it had probably peaked. But I didn't expect it to come down this quickly. I was surprised to see that people expected the trend to continue, but I didn't expect this haircut. So what's gone on? Well, 4.2% was the unemployment number for June, down from 4.4% in May. And the consensus was it was going to go up to 4.5. So it's a big miss to the downside, really. Now, you'll know I want to go deeper into the detail here, and I like to talk about inactivity as well. Inactivity, finally, the headlines have really started to catch up with this, and there's been a lot talking about this more recently, because really, apart from anything else, I think the press and overall the people in general want to see what Starmer and his government is going to do about it. So, backward-looking report still reports vacancies falling, but still 11% above pre-pandemic. Now, remember, we're talking about we're not talking about as real time as the PMIs here. We're talking about June still. So we've had more than a month and a half since the month that we're talking about. I've said for a while the PMIs are talking about vacancies expanding again rather than contracting, but the recruiters are not yet so bullish in the more real-time jobs reports. So there's a bit of conflicting information there, but I think we're very close to having roughly the same amount of vacancies month on month rather than this tail that there's been since early 2021 when there were just a ridiculous amount of vacancies in the job market once the pandemic was really biting through, taking effect, and the economy ultimately hadn't collapsed. They always also include an estimate, the ONS do, in the month for the month after, and for the first time in a while they're estimating that there will be 24,000 more payroll jobs. The last 6 months or so has been a negative estimate for the month in front. So as far as the real-time PAYE figures go, the progress is actually forward, not backward. So unemployment down, employment up, inactivity the same, but it's 22.2%. At the moment, and worse year on year. Now, the other big bit we get from the labour market report is the earnings data. So annual growth excluding bonuses, which is the one I've been watching closely, dropped to 5.4%. Why have I been watching this one more closely? Because the whole bonus thing has gone a bit strange since COVID, and we still need to wash that out of the figures. And this was the month where that was evidenced more than almost anywhere else ever, really, because Annual growth, including bonuses, dropped to a 4.5% increase. Now, there was a reason for this, and the ONS talked about it, and they recognised that the number that dropped out of the figures, June 2023, included NHS one-off bonuses, and that's the reason for the fast drop in that figure to 4.5. So 4.5 may be used in the headlines, but we're still much, much, much closer to 5.5 rather than 4.5, which is still way too high for a 2% inflationary environment. So real terms pay growth adjusted by CPIH, which is what the ONS prefer to do. So that's the consumer price index with a housing element put in it. Sat at 2.4 for the quarter for my preferred 5.4%, excluding bonuses measure, or 1.6 if you prefer to look at pay, including bonuses. We also lost 100,000 working days in June 2024, which were the most for a while, if you remember some of those perhaps cynical strikes just before the election. We also had in real time 135,000 more claimants for unemployment in July, which is a huge number. But the ONS have pointed out a change in the earnings threshold for full work search conditionality, and that means more recognised claimants by about 180,000 over 6 months. So we seem to have had most of those in the first month of that change, but we'll see if that's a real number or just something we need to basically ignore as a bit of a statistical anomaly or a measurement change apart from anything else. So that 2.4 is a pretty good number. We've got to be pretty happy with that. It's helping households go forward. Inactivity is really the problem that we need to spend a little bit more time on, because apart from anything else, there's no precedent for this in other developed nations. Long COVID or similar is no longer even being put forward as a credible reason by any commentators I can see. Changes in benefits, not means tested, perhaps almost self-certified to an extent, are probably the largest change since COVID, and the reality is these do need to be looked at and potentially drawn in significantly. And this is one of the areas where the pre-COVID Conservatives actually were successful, and it would be crass to pretend there wasn't some collateral damage, but they moved an awful lot more people into work in the 2010s one way or another. COVID and the support packages gave a good chunk of that progress back to a large extent. We lost a few years of employment growth, however you look at it, and are left with nearly 10 million between 16 and 64 who are not employed or seeking work. So, a little bit of further commentary on this. Firstly, the age brackets just look wrong these days. Education and student numbers need removing. Also, people are expected to work beyond their 65th birthday now, and that number will absolutely have to rise over time for the state pension to remain remotely affordable. For some context, Denmark is moving towards age 74. That's already been legislated for over time. Italy to 71, Sweden to 70, and the Netherlands to 70. Well, look, we're talking a period of up to 50 years where these changes are being phased in. But the UK retirement age would need to start with a 7 within more like a 30 or 40 year time period from analysis I've looked at in the past, depending on NHS reform or lack thereof. But inactivity is puzzling, and has puzzled many people because apart from anything else, there have been fewer people inactive due to childbirth, as there have been fewer children born by percentage. The cost of living is really taking the blame for most of the recent changes here. Participation rate of mothers with children from 3 to 5 years old has increased significantly between 2017 and 2019, when the 30 hours free childcare policy was first introduced, but then stalled, mostly blamed again on the rising cost of childcare. So, few commentators will even talk about the benefit system for fear of it being labelled political rather than economic, but the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is well respected and fairly central, perhaps slightly left-leaning as an economic think tank, have to their credit done exactly that. They published a report on this in April this year, and here's the summary of that report for you. 4.2 million working age individuals can claim at least one health-related benefit. That number was 3.2 million in 2019. The expectation is another 1.2 million cases by 2028 to 29, but it could be up to 1.6 million higher if the current levels of claims persist. Spending on disability and incapacity went from 35.5 billion in 2019-20 to 47.6 billion in 2023-24, which is up 12.1 billion or 34%. There's another 15.2 billion expected on that by 2028-29, and this is without any inflation adjustments, right? These are all 2024 prices. So that 34% increase from pre-pandemic is a real terms increase. It's already taken inflation into account. To put that another way, a 20-year-old today is about as likely to claim as a 39-year-old was in 2019. A 35-year-old is as likely as a 46-year-old in 2019. And a 55-year-old today is as likely to claim as a 60-year-old was in 2019. 2/3 of these claims are based on mental and behavioural disorders and musculoskeletal diseases. And theories for these moves are health getting worse amongst the population, the cost of living crisis, conditionality regimes, and the shift towards telephone assessments for these benefits. Solutions are difficult. Tightening benefits straightforwardly would cause some unwanted side effects. Tightening eligibility rules usually sounds good, but doesn't usually affect things in the way that's first thought. So some of that's slightly inflammatory, really. Everyone will have their theories, but I thought it was a pretty well-balanced summary, which is why I wanted to share it. What's clear is that something does need to be done, tested, measured and implemented to snap off this gigantic fiscal hole appearing in spite of the potential reasons cited, which in reality will probably be a mixture of them and some others that other people haven't thought of. So, enough on the inactivity piece. On to inflation. I'll be Mr. Broken Record here, saying it has gone back up. And a few months ago, I was predicting that it would go back up over 3% over the course of the next year. I'm happy to say that I feel a bit less confident in that prediction now, and I'll be very pleased to be wrong about that if I am. The 2% print eluded us, that was for July, although again the consensus was 2.3 and we printed 2.2 for CPI. Two favourable prints, the right side of consensus in 2 days after considering the unemployment figures as well, which is great news. Core CPI printed 3.3, which is again was 0.1 under the consensus figure and was 0.2 down from June's number. The month-on-month CPI rate was actually minus 0.2, which was great because that snapped off a nasty streak of 0.5% and more that had been going on for a few months on the month-on-months, and that was one of the things that was worrying me. Although I don't make decisions based on what happens in 1 month, I'll be following that closely next month as well. RPI printed 3.6 on an expected 3.3. Obviously next month's figures will have August's out, published in September, and Taylor Swift will probably again be getting the blame for inflationary things happening, certainly in the London area. Let's see. But RPI printed 3.6. The expectation was 3.3, but that didn't really seem to worry anyone, apart from anyone paying rent on an RPI-based lease or collecting rent based on an RPI-based lease, of course. Anyway, that's the mainstream. The ONS prefers to focus on CPIH, as I've said before, including housing costs, which would be a better proxy for the average household than just CPI. That rose from 2.8 to 3.1 in July. A fall of 0.3 in July 2023 dropped out of those figures, and that was blamed. Core CPIH stayed above 4%, I'm afraid, with a print of 4.1, down from 4.2, but still very worrying and too high. CPIH printed 5.7 on their services, which is still very high, but CPI services, which tends to be more talked about, dropped from 5.7 to 5.2. So for 1 month, a really quite significant drop, and good news. Again, most of that will be due to a larger increase dropping out of the figures from 12 months before. Now, regulars will know I like to keep my eye on OOH as well, which is this synthetic figure created to reflect the owner-occupier cost of housing. And that rose to a new high in the whole of the time series it's been going, 7% from 6.8. So if you start the measure in 2015, it's done less for inflation than both CPIH and CPI, but it is catching up very quickly at these sort of rates. The 7% is the highest rate since March 1992. That's when they started the series. And if you're thinking about Black Wednesday, well, that was September 1992, but we still had rife inflation in the early 90s. But my fear is, when will we actually see this peak? But with mortgage rates seemingly on the way back down in a fashion that seems a little bit more sustainable, hopefully those lower rates will start to weigh on household budgets a little more favourably than anyone who's dropped off a 2-year fixed rate over the past 18 months, or since Liz Truss briefly graced us with her presence at number 10. So the drill down graph isn't something I normally share, but it was very illuminating as to where all the inflation sits in July as far as the measurements go. It's just a graph with one big bar really saying housing and household services, and everything else is either up a bit or down a bit. Tells you where the inflation is in the household, in that roof over the head. You know, that side of the cost of living side of things is definitely not over yet, apart from anything else. But overall, a bit better than expected or hoped. Still above the target now again. Lower than expectations kept the markets happy as far as bonds, swaps and gilts grow. So then the third part of the triumvirate of the big three for the week, growth. GDP is always published in real terms, remember, so any lower inflation will provide a following wind for the figures. And in reality, I think this is why lots of the forecasters have got growth so badly wrong this year so far. Inflation has made people forget exactly how things work and are calculated, in my opinion. So the headlines were mixed because the growth results were mixed. The reality, for the second time this year so far, we had a 0% print in growth month on month. No movement at all. However, because this is the June figure, the focus was much more on the quarterly result, which printed 0.6 for Q2 and 0.9 year on year compared to 1 year ago. Now we've now got 2 quarters on the spin that produce negative figures in 2023, minus 0.1 and minus 0.3. They're going to drop out of the figures, and it's a strong part of my argument as to why we could reach 2% growth this year. Monthly is a bit of a short time period, really, so sometimes the accounting's a bit arbitrary. Something falls into this month rather than that month. I never get too carried away with 1 month's figures, as I always say. We've also got to remember it's election month, and if we think back to what the PMIs were saying at the time, they were saying big decisions were being put off in terms of spending, investment, all the rest of it, because of the election specifically, and people wanted to see what happened. So some of this may well bump into July, and July's print might be a bit better than anybody else expected because June's was disappointing. The PMIs in July seemed to rebound reasonably well, although they were much, much stronger in construction than they were in the other sectors. Although services did okay, so it did better than it did in June. So let's see what happens when those figures come out. But as I predicted, we are at over 1.3% plus growth for the first half of 2024. It would be a big surprise if the second half kept up at that pace. But you can easily see it only needs to be about half that pace for us to get to 2% growth this year or thereabouts. Q2 saw a 0.8% increase in services output, whereas production and construction both contracted 0.1%. Now, the PMIs for all of those three have been positive since we've had the end of Q2, so that drag shouldn't be recurring. Construction's leading the way on the PMIs, as I said last week in the supplement. Although this is not by turbocharging house construction, bear in mind. But if Labour Party policy does have any impact, you would expect that to be in a relatively short time period. And in the most recent PMIs, house building is very much nearly back to that level of 50 or parity, or perhaps even growing a little. GDP per head also moved forward 0.3 this quarter, which is great news. It was up 0.5 in Q1, and this is much more important for how people feel as a rule. And it's moved forward after a really bad year for GDP per cap in 2023. It moved down every quarter in 2023. And the figures for Q3 and Q4, which remember were a recession for the whole economy, were minus 0.4 and minus 0.6 per head, so a 1% drop over that half of the year. And those dropping out the figures will also help significantly. So growth's been outperforming this year. It's exceeded what we would have expected traditionally from the PMI data that we've had, which correlates strongly with the growth figures. And the PMIs, why do I like them so much? Because they're much more real time. You know, we're in mid-August talking about a report covering June and the second quarter. So some of this was relatively easy to see coming, with inflation being brought back under control, and that extra dividend has likely already now been realised, especially as the expected path of CPI from here is upwards, not downwards. Although that upwards move at the moment is expected to be quite small on the path back to 3%. These growth figures for June came in exactly as economic consensus expected. NISA, which is a mouthful of an organisation if I ever heard one, but the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, are forecasting 0.4% growth for Q3 GDP. And it looks like a good dart. I might just continue being positive and expect us to realise at least 0.4, as I think some of June's growth that was there underlying has been shunted into July. But let's see, it's just a theory, right? But if we did get 0.4, that would take us to 1.7 plus for the year, with a quarter to go. So let's see. So all's good, although GDP per capita is not exactly roaring, and we still have 1% growth or so to go before we're better off per head than we were in Q3 2019, which is going to need us to have another 3 to 4 quarters without a wobble, realistically. So to round up the macro anyway, I'll get into the gilts and swaps. Opened the week at 3.747, closed the week at 3.733 on the 5-year gilt, a tiny down week, which is fine. On the face of it, perhaps that's a bit of a surprise, really, given what I've said in the macro, but unemployment figures would suggest that rate cuts are not immediately required. Growth figures look okay, and the only real reason to fuel the rate cuts is an inflation print lower than expected, but of course it's still above the target. It was that inflation release actually that forced the gilt market down to about 3.6 on Wednesday when it started trading, but after the growth figures, the market reset itself. Thursday's close was 3.715, and the 5-year swap close on Thursday was 3.642. So that discount's still existing, and those rates are around 5.6 to 5.7 if you don't consider arrangement fees and all the rest of it. I'm talking about those being amortised. They're somewhat sustainable, it seems, at these levels. That's for limited company 5-year buy-to-let, just to be clear. The bets on the rate cuts got fewer this week on the basis of how the releases worked, and I'm sticking with what's been my out of the money view that the next cut isn't coming in 2024. I'm not a strong conviction on that, but I do think it's possible that we might not see another cut till Feb 25. I will watch with interest, of course, when the Federal Reserve what they do in a couple of weeks' time, of course. So, on to the meaty bit. Hardship tests. These have caused a flurry of speculation and worry on the landlord side of the fence in the past fortnight. The Telegraph did their usual these days to stoke as much concern as possible in their quest to get clicks, suggesting it would become impossible to evict poorer tenants. The reality, of course, is that many tenants occupy the bottom 30 to 40% of demographics in an area, although very few PRS landlords will be giving direct tenancies to those in the bottom 10 to 20% of income demographic if they're using any sort of affordability test at all in their tenant selection process. The Telegraph also covered the fact that a 10k cap on EPCs would mean 90% of Ds could become Cs, but only 60% of Es could become Cs. There's a gigantic disparity, of course, between landlords who rely on third parties to organise and perform works for them, have a traditional agent who employs traditional builders, and ones who would be able to mobilise their own teams for energy efficiency measures if they needed to. But I'm going to speak more on that later. So the proposed hardship test would probably look from 3 perspectives. Number 1, does the tenant, or presumably one of the tenants, suffer from a serious illness such as terminal cancer? Would the tenant lose his or her job if they were evicted? And would an eviction result in the tenant being left homeless? Now, what you might have noticed there is the one-way nature of those questions, of course, in what's a two-way contract. I immediately want to ask, firstly, is number 1 true of the landlord? Would number 2, from a landlord perspective, turn into, has the landlord lost his or her income from the property, i.e. are there rent arrears? And 3, would a non-eviction result in the landlord losing their house thanks to repossession or similar? The NRLA has also acted to be a voice in the space, as you'd expect, because of all of the speculation that started. Firstly, they've questioned the source, which is rightly so, because this is the Telegraph, but it's just part of a Telegraph tapestry that's talking to us about the incoming war on landlords by Labour. In reality, none of us will forget the government attitude to landlords from 2015 onwards, which was fairly relentless, with only the brief respite of a half-hearted scrapping of the EPC targets by Ritchie last year, which I think we all expected to come back. So I'm also suspicious, but I was also very vocal in saying that a failure to pass the Renters Reform Bill, as it was, would lead to a much less favourable bill from the landlord perspective going through the Houses of Parliament. Penny Cook, the Housing Minister, did table several amendments to the Renters Reform Bill when he was in opposition, proposing hardship components to certain grounds for possession, and this seems like the root cause of the speculation, according to the NRLA, and that makes sense to me. There's nothing that Penny Cook has said in public that I can find about these hardship tests. The detail is that the 3 grounds that were targeted for eviction for occupation by the landlord, so this is not across the board, right? Or it wasn't in the counter proposals put in by Penny Cook, right? These were about, so this is in a world where we get rid of section 21, remember? So if the landlord wanted to occupy the property, or one of their family members did, right? He wanted to put a hardship test in that situation. On the sale of the property, and this is where I start to get particularly animated, because infringing private property rights like that is a very slippery slope that I'd be strongly opposed to, of course, because I'm against anti-big state in situations like this, meddling with individuals and their assets. And then the other ground that was targeted was 6A for facilitating compliance with enforcement action, i.e. there's presumably not a prohibition order because the law requires them to leave, but an improvement notice, which is then used as a ground for eviction. So the first thing to note is this doesn't cover rent arrears, or it didn't. Of course, he might get more hungry in power compared to when in opposition. So it might be cold comfort, that statement. But to reiterate, it would seem ridiculous to potentially make a landlord homeless under the loose definition we insist on using for that very emotive word, because to evict their tenant would otherwise make the tenant homeless, and the state determining what private individuals can do with their assets doesn't fit with our market-based system. It does fit though, and often, as in these situations, we take a look north of the border. So Scottish provisions at the moment are around a less concerning rhetoric on the face of it of reasonableness when determining possession. That sounds like a much better framing, and I think the government could learn a lot from the way that's been framed. Scotland does provide us with some precedent. Shelter themselves admit that reasonableness is normally just stating the facts of the case. There is a case in Scotland, Manson and Downey versus Turner and Turner. The latter were the landlords, they wanted to sell the property. The former didn't want to leave, based on the grounds in Scotland that provision for possession, and they wanted to talk about it on reasonableness grounds. Now, the landlord's side of the case tried to argue the tenant's circumstances weren't relevant. That was never really going to fly, to be honest, because that doesn't sound very reasonable, does it? That was set aside, and so that precedent wasn't created. Instead, the court considered all of the facts, and that's what the spirit of the rules asks them to do. The case was seen as a victory for tenants' rights, since the landlord can no longer get automatic possession because they're selling the property based on these new laws. But in this specific case, what happened is the time for enforcement in terms of possession was kicked out to 4 months. We aren't privy to the tenant's particular circumstances in this case, but that was the decision by the first tier tribunal. Often legislation does migrate down from Scotland or from Wales to England. I've praised the Scottish system in the past, and overall I've got some fairly significant experience in it. I found it to be quite balanced and fair. I can of course come up with some contrived examples, and they're bound to happen, although they don't seem to have happened thus far. There have been cases where possession has been prevented on reasonableness grounds, but not leading to significant issues for landlords, more when it's prevented eviction of tenants that it sounds like no landlord would really want to keep. But the only solution here, like always, is to ensure that your referencing processes are very robust in the first place. So, my thoughts on that part are then the couple of years we've had so far of this system in Scotland, it has not led or contributed to the issues in the PRS up there. There are issues up there, but overwhelmingly, my sense is that they were created by a rent cap of 0% in winter 22, which then went to a 3% cap, which could be 6% if you could prove costs had gone up. I mean, go figure that. No one could prove that costs hadn't gone up, I don't think. And then today they've moved to an effective 12% cap now year on year before a tribunal gets involved. So what's the reality in that situation? It puts much more pressure on the sector overall, and then councils, because everyone gets a 3 to 6% rise and then a 12% rise. Whereas if left alone, the average rent rise wouldn't have been anywhere near 15 to 18% overall over those 2 years. This has been evidenced by Scotland having the fastest growing rents in the country for many months on the spin, before Northern Ireland wrestled the gauntlet from them relatively recently, as the Brexit dividend continues to work its magic on the capital values and the rental market over there. Back to the hardship test focus anyway, to round that off. The point is, as usual, the best approach here is to keep calm and carry on and wait to see what comes through Parliament. You have to note, again, I'm going to reiterate, Pennycook has not spoken directly to the press about these tests. It's all been implied from previous behaviour. I don't doubt that he'll be in favour. Why would he have changed his mind in a relatively short time frame, especially now they're in government? However, he has at least thought before opening his mouth, unlike his colleague, Mr. Ed Miliband. So, Mr. M, you will remember, was ahead in the opinion polls in 2015 to depose what had been a fairly limp but largely uncontroversial coalition government, and then he failed to do so. Many often hark back to the fact that the Labour Party chose the wrong Miliband, as he had defeated his own brother in a leadership election, and indeed David does seem to be the more visionary, erudite and sensible. But so it comes to pass in 2024 that Ed is the energy minister. It's always been his passion, and that's what he was before he was the leader of the Labour Party. And let's be fair, the energy policy of the UK has been littered with errors for the past 40 years. That's nothing to do with the colour of the government. However, Think before you speak comes to mind. Ed has stuck his oar in on the EPCs. No one was surprised, and a 2030 target doesn't immediately strike fear into the heart. It all depends on how it's done, doesn't it? Those who are involved in housing tenants in secondary market stock in any sort of meaningful scale, and who've done it for some time, have seen all sorts of schemes come and go. Green Deal springs to mind. A great idea, really, if the improvements stack up. Low-cost loans can be given and recovered through the bills for the property. The issue, of course, that a 10k spend might return £400 a year on average of savings, and no one, even the government, can organise and administer funding that at break even at a 4% return or a 25-year payback. We're too little too late now. The era of cheap money is over. Super cheap money anyway. There have been many other grant schemes. Eco 4 is a recent one. Matched funding also. Perhaps the government providing a third or two-thirds of the funding. In reality, those schemes do have a tendency to transfer wealth from the providers of the scheme to the providers, to the contractors, because they just ramp up all their pricing accordingly. And there are not usually enough providers for a competitive market to be formed. And the timelines don't normally work very well for that. It isn't easy, but many schemes focus on the situation of the tenant, who in today's world is highly likely to be in receipt of some kind of benefit, as so many households are, and then they'll act accordingly from there. I'm also aware of some pilot schemes going on in various parts of the country where works are being done for free to improve some rented property. I've held the view ever since the first mutterings of EPC C, which I believe was back in 2021, the grant system, especially in lower value properties, is the only way this will happen. Ed, you see, like so many politicians, seems to have no idea how it really works in poorer areas of the UK. If you've got PRS properties that are worth, even in today's money fueled by inflation, 50 or 60 grand, or flats that are even cheaper, then a 10k spend is utterly uncommercial and unthinkable. Rents can easily still be below 500 quid a month. After costs, let alone if there's finance against these properties, you're talking well over 100 months to get that money back. If those landlords live off their relatively measly income from said properties, then unless they've got 50 or more of these properties, they're not living some kind of incredible lifestyle. They've got paper money from legacy capital growth, although sometimes it can be quite weak in such areas. To tell them they've got to spend at least 10 grand a property is just not going to work. So hopefully you can follow that to start with. It's the poorest, relatively of course, of both the landlords and the tenants that will take it hardest from ill thought out Westminster policy if Ed isn't careful. So Ed's coming from a place where all landlords are minted without thinking about it as a business. This is very foolish. If you lined up all the landlords in the UK and picked the typical one, or the modal landlord, you'd pick a professional with one extra property they were lucky enough to pick up on the way. They'd be in their 50s or 60s and they'd be suffering from Section 24 tax. To tell them another 10 grand or more needs to go in may well be a straw that breaks the camel's back at a time where PRS supply is under significant pressure and is doing its part in forcing rents upwards. They wouldn't be millionaires, and their position would primarily likely be because of the fruits of hard work. Yes, of course it would, but also just time. I've said before, whilst I'm a huge admirer of Warren Buffett, in many ways the wisest thing he's ever done is be around for so long. At 94, the miracle of compound interest has truly had time to do its work. If you ever look at a graph of his net worth, you will know it's like a hockey stick, ramping up much more the nearer you get to the present day. Ed doesn't seem to realise this. He instead chooses rhetoric like, one thing that this government will do that the last government did not is demand that landlords raise the standard of their accommodation to a proper energy performance certificate standard C by 2030. There's a few reasons why this is silly, of course. Number one, it's hostile towards the landlord. Number two, we're not going to be using the energy performance certificate next year if plans go ahead. There's a different name for it, which I'm not even going to be bothered to commit to memory right now, because until the change is actually done, we'll see. But the consultation has been done on that. So goodness knows what that will mean. And also, there's a big problem here that no one's mentioned, right? If we start looking at EPCs and what they say the work should cost for EPCs, then that's all fine, well and good. But a lot of those costs, especially if those EPCs were carried out before 2020, are way out of date. There's massive inflation. There's been closer to 40% inflation in construction materials, works and jobs and things like that. So if it was 10 grand on the EPC in 2019, that's going to be at least 14 grand's worth of works now. And that's where another problem will arise. Now, of course, we're only talking the problem by 2030, but we're only phasing out the EPC old system, if we are, from 2025 onwards, when the new one comes in. So how are they going to deal with that? Let's see. But look, let's think about demand, right? Not enough landlords to achieve this or facilitate loans, for example. It would take an option. Loans are one way to maybe keep some people in the sector that would otherwise exit, maybe if they're interest free, I don't know. His take is that it will bring 3 million people out of fuel poverty. The problem that's overstated because of the gigantic fluctuations in energy prices thanks to Russia and their incursion into Ukraine in 2022. But look, let's focus on the historic arguments that get trotted out here. Firstly, an increase in the cost of provision will lead to increased rents. I can never get my head around how anyone even bothers to try and argue with this. This argument holds water in literally every other private sector economic market. In inflationary times, we've had a million examples of this over recent years. Why would rents not be the same? Cost of delivery goes up, cost of end product goes up. It is as simple as that. Sensible calls in the sector are for immediate clarity, whereas Ed, like many before him and many after him, I'm sure, has chosen to shoot his mouth off first and provide detail later. A plan would be nice to see, especially if there already is one. Repit has published some data suggesting the upgrade bill is over £24 billion, with more than £10,000 per average property needed. The average landlord is not making anywhere near 10k per property from their portfolios as a start. In the same breath, Payprop did a recent survey showing that 50% of tenant moves in the past 12 months were due to landlords selling up. So I think Ed probably needs to bear that in mind as well, doesn't he? What needs to happen? Well, firstly, I think Ed could do with spending some time understanding the sector and then explain how this can be funded. The landlord pocket as the only answer, I think genuinely really could lead to an exodus in the sector. And I'm not someone who normally says inflammatory things like that. But I think if that was to happen, it would be particularly geographically concentrated. Right? Then he needs to explain how it would be resourced, because these measures take time, are often working around tenants in situ. Retrofitting is difficult, expensive and inefficient. So come on, Ed. The tenants of the country are banking on you to do a good job here. Frame it that way in your head. Their future is in your hands. If there will be a cap, and there's talk that the Labour proposals won't even have this 10k cap, then how about that cap being a percentage of the market value of the property, surely? Or based on the monthly rental amount, not based on an arbitrary one-size-fits-all, which applies to a rental in an ex-colliery town in the northeast and a swish pad in Mayfair. Get your ducks in a row, communicate fast. Just because that timeline isn't this Parliament, because 2030 will be the next Parliament, doesn't mean that alongside hardship tests and the next speculative piece, whatever it is, this isn't worth investing the time into. Have a think about your language as well, old boy. I know you were born in Fitzrovia, went to Oxford, etc., but you also represent the people of Doncaster North. Spend some time understanding your constituents' housing stock, rental stock. You're in the ideal location for it, man. So, enough. I hope that puts some colour around some of the recent speculation and rhetoric. I wanted to have my say on it. Well done as always for getting to the end. I hope you enjoyed this week, and apologies for more doses of politics than normal, but they do seem to be particularly relevant at the moment. Thanks for your attention. I hope it was of use. And don't forget to book your super early bird tickets for the 4th Property Business Workshop of the year at bit.ly/PBWFOUR. Now, there's only one way we can deal with all of this continual noise and the unfolding chapters of new Labour. Keep calm, always listen to the supplement, and carry on. Thank you.